Good morning. For this morning's coffee note, I want to just share some reflections on the importance of course design, of program and module design, and the use of 5 different domains of learning. I think there's something of certainly a tradition in higher education, certainly in the UK, to design modules somewhat reluctantly using intended learning outcomes, and I'll do another video about that. But even when faculty and designers do use intended learning outcomes, they tend to design learning with a really very heavy emphasis on the intellectual skills. It might seem appropriate given it's a university program, but almost inevitably the result is that you have a module that is devoid of other skills. They might include an outcome around group work or some aspect of communication skills. But I think the best way to design modules and programs is to embark on a process of identifying how a particular course of study can reflect 5 different domains of learning, and to hold these 5 in mind as you go through the design process. And I would argue that all 5 domains have a place in every single module and every single program to a greater or lesser extent. So the 5 domains of learning I encourage people to use are the cognitive domain, so those are the intellectual skills, so the cognitive domain, the affective domain, which is the values, effectively, the psychomotor domain, which is manual, physical, dexterity type skill set development, and then 2 that are very often completely neglected in higher education, one of which is the metacognitive, the kind of personal epistemology dimension of learning, and the interpersonal domain, which is very often completely left out of any program design. So those 5 domains should be reflected in the intended learning outcomes for any module or program, to a greater or lesser extent. So, for example, if you're teaching a first-year undergraduate program, say around history or some humanities subject, it might be that there really is a need to front-load a lot of information to the student. They need to acquire certain knowledge as a basis for future learning. And it would then be entirely appropriate to have the majority of your intended learning outcomes to be in the cognitive domain, possibly in the metacognitive domain. So that would be very much about acquisition of knowledge. If, on the other hand, you're teaching a third-year chiropractic program or a dentistry program or some other program that requires a certain amount of physical skill and dexterity, then you would expect surely the intended learning outcomes to reflect that. So you might have 3 or 4 outcomes, all of which relate to a psychomotor skill set, and there might be very little in the way of intellectual skill development by this stage in a program. So I think the profile of individual modules based on the intended learning outcomes should demonstrate that kind of pattern, that kind of focus across the provision. They rarely do. The vast majority of modules have 3, 4, 5 intellectual skills, a few communication type skills defined, and rarely anything else. And I think that's a great shame. So this short video is basically an advocacy for those 5 domains of learning to be incorporated into any program design. And I'll explore each one in turn in other videos.